Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Dawn, for the introduction. Hello, everyone. Like Dawn mentioned, I am Morgan Yoshimura. I am the Coordinator of Services to Adults for the San Antonio Public Library. And I am joining today to just share, I guess, an announcement of sorts before we get started with today's presentation. I am joining today to share and acknowledge that a Holocaust survivor who has called San Antonio her home for quite some time passed away recently. Her name was Rose Sherman Williams, and she was very, very active with the Holocaust Memorial Museum up until about 18 months ago. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and to share a little bit of information about Rose. And then we're going to do a moment of silence to honor Rose, her life and her passing. Bear with me, I will be reading this from a document. So Rose Williams, a Holocaust survivor and dedicated volunteer, spent decades sharing her story of resilience, honoring her family's memory, and inspiring others with her message of perseverance. Born in Radom, Poland in 1927, so Rose was 97 when she passed away recently. Rose had a happy childhood with her parents and three siblings. Her father owned a letter factory, and life was peaceful until 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Rose was just 12 years old when her world changed forever. The Sherman family was forced to leave their home and move into a ghetto where they lived in a single room. In 1942, the ghetto was liquidated, and Rose was separated from her family. She was sent to work in an ammunition factory before being transported to Auschwitz, where she was tattooed with a number. Life in Auschwitz was harsh. Rose suffered frostbitten feet due to lack of shoes, but she found strength in the reunification with her sister Binet, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but as the war neared its end, Rose was forced on a brutal march to Bergen-Belsen, one of the worst camps she witnessed. Finally, on April 15th, 1945, British troops liberated her. After the war, Rose moved to Stuttgart, Germany, before making her way to the United States and settling in San Antonio, Texas, where she built a life with her husband, Jack, and raised their family. In 2019, Rose published her memoir, Letters to Rose, a Holocaust memoir with letters of impact and inspiration from the next generation, co-written with Becky Hoag and Robin Philbrick. Through this and countless speaking engagements, Rose shared her story with thousands of students and visitors, ensuring that her legacy of survival and hope would inspire generations to come. Rose was preceded in death by her husband, Jack, and her son, Peter. She is survived by her son, AJ, his wife, Mary, her three grandsons, Alexis, Jason, Sammy, and extended family, particularly Becky Hoag, who gave Rose special cares for years. May Rose's memory be a blessing, and may her story continue to inspire others. At this time, we're going to take a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn it back over to Dawn shortly. But as I do, I'm going to put a few links in the chat. I will put a link to the Holocaust Memorial Museum's website that has more information about Rose. I'm 99% sure we do have Rose's book in the library's collection, so I will put that link. And then this coming Tuesday, January 14th at 6 p.m. Becky Hogue, who you heard me mention, had a very, very close relationship with Rose and helped write the memoir. She will be presenting, and this is going to continue as planned. Becky was insistent that this continue to honor Rose. That is at Cody on Tuesday, January 14th, this coming Tuesday at 6 p.m. So if you'd like to learn more about Rose, you can join us then. So thank you. And Dawn, I'll give it back to you.
Thank you so much, Morgan, and thank you for that beautiful tribute to Rose. I'd like to introduce our special guest today, Eleanor Gossing. She was born and raised in San Antonio. Eleanor is a creative professional with a passion for design in her community. With experience in graphic design, marketing, and communications, they thrive on creating meaningful connections and impactful projects. Eleanor is also dedicated to her Jewish identity and community, volunteering with the Holocaust Museum and Jewish Federation to support education and cultural preservation. And I will now turn this over to Eleanor, and we will hear Ruth's story, a story of resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, everyone. My name is Eleanor Gosson, and I am Ruth Reif's granddaughter, and I am happy to share her story with y'all today. So, growing up, I knew that my grandmother Ruth wasn't like my other grandmother or my friends' grandmothers. She was a little different. She was more anxious, some may say a little quirky. She always worried about if my sister and I were eating enough, as well as everyone else around her. She was nervous about every single thing. And as a child, I might have even labeled her a little dramatic. It's only now as an adult that I understand why she was the way she was. Now as an adult, I fully understand how my childhood and my family was one that had the shadow of the Holocaust looming over it, and it still does in many ways. My Ruth was extremely open about her story. Ruth recorded testimonials for Yale University and the Shoah Foundation. She went to local schools and spoke to the students. Ruth was always willing to share her story with anyone that asked, especially my own father. But when it came to her children and her grandchildren, she was much more guarded. She would touch on it occasionally throughout her childhood, and I knew that my grandmother was a Holocaust survivor, but she would never go into depth about her past. She did not want to burden her children with the horrors of her youth, and in many ways, she found it easier to speak with a stranger. Much of what I have learned about my own grandmother came from my parents. It is only now that I am able to piece her story together myself through her own words that I can fully understand what she went through and what happened to her and what shaped not only her life, but my mother's and my own. My grandmother Ruth was born in Pabianice, Poland on the 18th of January in 1927, a small town about 10 kilometers or 6 miles southwest of Łódź. Pabianice had a bustling Jewish community where Ruth attended a Jewish day school, grew up in a kosher home, and celebrated Shabbos every Friday night. While the family was not large, they were extremely close, and Ruth was the youngest of 3 children. Her older sister Adela was 10 years older than her, and her brother Abram was 9 years older. Though much older, her siblings always looked out for Ruth and often treated her like the baby that she was. Ruth's father, Shmuel Chaskel, owned a successful hardware and lumber store, and her mother, Bronya, often helped in the store to run it. Ruth had curly blonde hair, usually like me, not today, fair skin, and blue eyes. My grandmother said people in her hometown often could not believe that she belonged to her parents and would ask them, "Why do you have such a Gentile girl?" For the most part, her childhood was idyllic until it wasn't. When rumors of war and the Germans' activities began circulating, her father dismissed them. Her brother Abram, however, did not. He spoke fluent German in addition to his Polish, and also a language called Esperanza. My grandmother always said he was incredibly smart. Many young people in Poland escaped to Russia, and he wanted to go as well. But Shmuel thought the war would only last a few weeks and stopped him from going. In 1938, the World's Fair was being held in New York, and Abram had the opportunity to go and leave Poland. But he knew if he did, he may not be able to come back. And again, he chose to stay in Poland. He had visited Germany the year before as a delegate for a conference and had noticed that the things had begun to shift, but only slightly. There were still some Jews left in Germany, but many had already gone. Their businesses had been closed, but no one would say why or where they had gone. In Pabianica, things began to change for Ruth. Ruth began not being able to attend school, so her parents hired her a private tutor while they could. At one point, the Germans were conducting a search for young girls, and to keep Ruth hidden and safe, her family hid her in a tall water tower, like a reservoir, for 2 to 3 days until it quieted down. When they brought her back down, Ruth was incredibly sick. Before the war, her parents had bought an apartment building from a German man. After the war began, he came back with 2 German soldiers and took that apartment building back. In 1941, Ruth's brother was taken from their home, and her family shortly after. At the beginning, people knew where the men were taken. And her brother Abram was in a camp called Benchen. He would often write letters to them. His letters always included 2 things. Take care of Ruth, make sure she is getting an education and learning, and to save his library. They did both for as long as they were able to. Her father, Shmuel, was taken to a camp that we believe to be the Kelmo Death Camp. In the summer of 1942, on May 15th, all of the remaining Jews of Pabianica were told to stand in front of their homes for a count, and then they would be able to go back inside. However, they were never allowed to go back inside. Ruth, her mother, Bronya, and her sister, Adela, were taken to the Pabianica ghetto. One night at 2 a.m., after months in the ghetto, they liquidated it and loaded them into cable cars. Ruth and Adela were separated from Bronya and had no idea whether she was alive or not. With no idea where they were going, no food or water, they finally arrived in the Lodz ghetto. Bronya's sister had a nephew who was the director of a housing unit in Lodz and was able to find Ruth and Adela and reunite them with their mother about 3 to 4 days after arriving in the ghetto. There was little food, and what they were given, Adela made sure to give to Ruth. Since she was the youngest, they wanted to make sure Ruth survived. They would save the coffee rinds and peels of potatoes to make food. Bronya and Adela would go to work while they were in Lodz, and they lived in constant fear, witnessed daily killings and trucks driving around the ghetto constantly. When the Lodz ghetto was liquidated in 1944, the 3 of them were once again taken. This time, their destination was Auschwitz. When they arrived at the selection process, Ruth was directed into one line, Adela and Bronya into the other. Bronya was screaming and yelling for Ruth to join them, but an officer pushed her into another line with the rifle. That was the last time Ruth ever saw her mother and sister. The line that Bronya and Adela were put into was the line to the gas chamber. Ruth was just 17 years old. Perhaps it was because she was young, or maybe it was because she was pale, blonde, and blue-eyed. That is one thing that we will never know, because we've never seen pictures of her family. We don't know whether her father had blonde hair, or if Adela had blue eyes, or if Abraham was perhaps pale. The only photo that survived with my grandmother Ruth was one of her as a child and one of Bronya. In Auschwitz, they shaved Ruth's head, stripped her of her clothing, assigned her a number, and sent her to work. By the time she had arrived, they had already stopped the tattooing. Ruth was woken up every morning at 3 a.m. with the sound of guards yelling, "Zappel, Zappel," meaning roll call. Ruth was later picked in a transport, transferred to Bergen-Belsen for 2 weeks, then sent to an ammunition factory called Wassag in Dusseldorf, Germany. For 8 months, Ruth was taken to work at 6 a.m. until 5 p.m. The only opportunity to shower was with 60 girls standing at once. They were fed soup, and then the day would repeat. Ruth thought she was going to die. They were going to kill her and the others systematically and keep her until she could no longer work. Many POWs were also kept in the factory, and there was one Frenchman who would sneak the girls 2 rolls until he got caught 2 weeks later. They never saw him again. Ruth would lay in the factory at night with no food and hardly any clothing and wonder what and when would be her ending, not believing she would survive. Ruth didn't want to believe about her parents, sister, and brother. She had no more feelings, and she simply had nothing left. In 1945, the Germans could tell the end was coming, and they were not going to come out victorious. They loaded the remaining 750 girls, Jewish girls, the last transport, on a freight train, but the railroads had already been destroyed. They sent the train going back and forth near a town called Potsdam for 7 days. On Hitler's birthday, the British were sending bombs, and not knowing there were people on the trains, bombed it. 500 girls died instantly, and the German guards ran off into the woods in fear of being caught. Ruth was severely injured, with 7 pieces of shrapnel in her side and all of her ribs broken. But her and a few girlfriends that managed to survive took off into the woods. They were free. The war as they knew it was over. They ran for 42 miles. Along the way, they found a Frenchman who helped carry Ruth to a close town, Ballets, where they asked for help at a local clinic. But there was no doctor there. Though the Germans had gone, Ruth and her friends were afraid to say that they were Jewish and only identified themselves as Polish girls. They stayed overnight, but they had heard that the Germans were coming back. So Ruth and her friends left and went 22 miles to the next town. At this point, Ruth only weighed 70 pounds. When they came to the other town, there was no one there, but they couldn't go any further. Ruth and her friends were put in a little hospital for care. The nurse brought them medicine, and again, they were too afraid to take it. While Ruth was in the hospital, she saw 2 men dressed in Polish uniforms, and she heard them speaking in a room next door. She had a suspicion that they may be Jewish, and so she invited them into her room to talk. They were Jewish POWs for the last 6 years, one from Krakow and one from Warsaw. They had left and returned with a truck to take Ruth and her 2 girlfriends back to a cottage, far away from the town, where an Italian doctor was able to operate on Ruth's hand and remove the shrapnel without anesthesia. It took Ruth 4 months before she was able to physically leave. Ruth befriended one of the doctors, and after a 3-week journey, they arrived back in Poland together. They all went their separate ways, but Ruth went back to Lodz to see if by chance anyone had survived. My grandmother stayed there for a few days and went to her aunt's leather business in Lodz, but no one had returned. Ruth was the only survivor of her family. Unsure of what to do and not quite wanting to go back home, Ruth ran into a classmate from Pabianica, and he convinced her to return with him, so she did. Yet again, no one from her family had returned. A friend of her brother Abram was on a committee, similar to the Jewish Federation here, and took Ruth in for a while, but she became extremely depressed. She would volunteer in kitchens for people who came back and helped with the young children, but her heart was broken, and she eventually isolated herself. My grandmother did not want to see or speak to anyone, but the doctor from the forest came to visit her. He would come every once in a while to see her. He tried to encourage Ruth to live again. The Polish people were not very nice, but there were a few who were. Ruth would go and see her parents' old tenants to ask about them, and one had kept the yardstick of her father's lumber yard and let her keep it. While back home, Ruth met a couple who were in the same camp as her brother Abram, and they lived together for a short time. But still, Ruth had no interest in living. Friends of her parents returned to Pabianica, and they took Ruth in and took care of her for a while again. They had met a nice young man that they thought would be suitable for Ruth. This is an example here of where I was always told a different story. I had always been told by my mom, who was told by her mother, Ruth, that she met her husband, my grandfather Felix, in a DP camp. The story we were told was that there were two Felixes, and Ruth went with the nicer one. You can imagine my mom's response when watching one of her testimonies to find out that perhaps that wasn't the actual story. My grandmother explained in her video that her parents' friends convinced her to let them bring him to Pabianica for her to meet, and she agreed. They wanted Ruth to find someone so that she would not be alone. So Felix kept coming to visit while he was in the military. They eventually got married and moved to Krakow, and then Ruth got pregnant. To most people, a child after such tragedy would be a blessing, but not to Ruth. After the war, my grandmother did not want children. This was not a secret in our family. What will I tell my children if they ask about God? How can I believe in God? This is what Ruth feared. A woman who had lost everything could not bear the thought of her children living through what she did. But Ruth had three: Sammy, Helena, or Lala, but I call her Mom, and Arlene. And my grandmother drove them all crazy in her own way. They were her whole life. Things were getting bad in Poland again, and when they found out that they were expecting, Ruth and Felix decided to leave. There was an underground organization called Bracha that smuggled Ruth and Felix back through the border. They were told to be silent if they were questioned and had to destroy everything that they had built up again. Photos, documents, objects, they weren't allowed to bring anything with them. Ruth and Felix were smuggled through to Germany, then to Czechoslovakia, and finally to Salzburg, Austria. Sammy, my uncle, was born in a DP camp before they were taken to a permanent camp while they awaited transport to the US. Felix still had the majority of his siblings and his parents, but they were in Russia and immigrating to Canada. When the war first began, 8 days after it broke out and the Germans invaded, on a Friday afternoon before Shabbos, the first victim in Pabianica was Ruth's uncle, Shmuel's brother. He had gone out for bread and was shot dead. But Shmuel had another brother who heeded the warnings before Germany invaded, and he had taken his family to Dallas, Texas. In 1949, now pregnant with their second child, my mom, Felix, Ruth, and Sammy boarded a boat to New Orleans with a final destination of San Antonio. They were able to enter the US because of her uncle. Ruth had a chance at a new life, but the horrors of the Holocaust haunted her every single day. Though my grandmother Ruth blended into the American way of life, Ruth's way of thinking was different. American parents weren't as overprotective as they were. If Ruth's kids went out, she would stay awake until they came home. I remember my grandmother sleeping with all of the lights and TV on. Ruth refused to go over bridges or highways, and whenever we flew, she had to cover her face with a scarf. As a little child, I thought she was just afraid to fly. Ruth constantly lived in fear, always fearing they would come back and take her and now her children. I see that fear now in my mother and her sister. While different in each of them, I now know where it comes from. I am also acutely aware of what can happen when the world turns against us as a people or chooses to live with hatred in their hearts. On the eve of the Second World War, Poland was home to over 3 million Jews. In my grandmother's hometown, there was over 15,000 Jews out of a population of 51,000. Only around 3,000 survived. My grandmother was the only survivor of her own family. Ruth's youth was stolen from her, and much of her future was too. Though my grandmother created a life in America, she was always that little Polish Jewish girl. I now know why my grandmother Ruth was anxious, quirky, nervous, and different, but she was definitely not dramatic, at least about her past. I learn more about my grandmother each time I talk to somebody who knew her or listened to a different part of her story. My grandmother always said she spoke because she wanted to make sure that it never happens again. It doesn't matter what race or religion you are because we are all human beings. We lost Ruth entirely too soon, but as a third generation survivor, and her granddaughter, I believe there's no better way to honor her memory than to share her story. And though there are missing pieces, I try to share it to the best of my ability and as much of her own words as I can. Thank you all for listening to Ruth's story.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for sharing Ruth's story with us. Wow, what a life. Oh my goodness. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, so thank you, Yasmin. She thanked us for sharing. Thanked Eleanor for sharing Ruth's story. Does anybody have any questions about Ruth's story? Questions for Eleanor?
Yeah.
Jeanette, are you raising your hand?
Yes, I am.
Oh, hi.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you, Eleanor, so much. I appreciate your telling your grandmother's story. I had the honor of writing your grandmother's story for the book published by the Holocaust Memorial Museum, including your grandmother's story there with 19 other survivors. It was a blessing to read her story, and to hear you tell it was just even a greater blessing to me. I feel like I knew your grandmother, even though I don't think I ever got to meet her. But I feel that she lived it was a very difficult life, but she was a strong woman from my understanding of what happened and so on. And I just want to say my personal thank you for your telling her story.
Thank you so much, and what an honor to meet you for having written that book.
Might I add my thanks also? I am so grateful that we have this history of all these individuals, and especially your grandmothers, because, like you say, if we don't learn the history, it will repeat itself. And so I am grateful for that and for your willingness to come here today and to share that with us. So thank you.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Okay. You're muted.
Do we have any other questions or comments?
Yeah. Let's see. Can y'all hear me okay? Am I coming through now? Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we're having some technology things today, apparently. I was gonna repeat, like Dawn said, if y'all have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. But I wanted to ask a bit of a question of my own for Eleanor. When you were at the very beginning talking about your grandmother and how there were only there was only that singular photo of her and the singular photo of her sister, it reminded me of something I had read in
a book by Anderson Cooper where he talked about journeying to other countries and seeing people who didn't have photographs of themselves and how it was this great tragedy that their stories were lost. So my question to you that I thought it would be interesting for you to chat about a little bit is, with all of that in mind, how does this affect kind of your view of documenting your life and your story? How do you feel about, like, taking pictures, when it comes to you and your family? Kind of what are you doing to help preserve memories? And do you have any suggestions for other people? Because, a lot of people don't like having their picture taken, but it's so important that we have pictures of our family for when they're gone. So, yeah.
Yeah, so the only two remaining photos that my grandmother was able to kind of smuggle through, they were, like a wallet size, like this big. So she was able to get the photo of her and her mother. Um, that's a very interesting question. I don't know if it's because of that. I've never thought about it, but I actually do dabble in photography. So I do love to capture memories and photos, especially of my own family, whether they're good or bad, or whether they know that I'm taking them. But I think it's very important to live in the present and in the moment. And so taking photos is something that I do love. Um, I think the most photographed thing I have in my phone really is my dog, but I also mostly my sister and my mom. Um, so I think it's just important that, if you are living in the moment and having a memorable moment, you take a photo, and that photo will always ignite that memory. And it's nice to have, because we don't have that of my mom's family. Um, and that's led to a lot of questions of my own. But because we don't have those missing links, we don't know a lot about her family. And we've never really been able to find out a lot because nothing was left. So being able to now to have those documents of our own family is really, it's more precious.
Great. Thank you for that answer. Well, everyone, if there are no other questions, I suppose we can prepare to sign off, with a reminder, of course, that we do have several other Holocaust Learn and Remember events happening. I believe that we shared some links in the chat, and there's also a LibGuide with some additional information that I'll grab the link for as well. And I encourage you to attend our programs and check them out, because there are so many important stories being told like this one. And I want to thank Eleanor for coming in and sharing this with us today. We appreciate you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, anything else you want to say before we start heading off?
No, just thank you everyone for coming. And like you said, I encourage to go to all the other programs because every story of a survivor is so uniquely different, but also so important. So.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So I have dropped the link in the chat for our LibGuide for the San Antonio Public Library, our Learn and Remember series. You can see our schedule of events and see what else is coming up. We have quite a few different programs, so we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much for coming, and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.